to the dairy industry and to many other across many markets. So I'd like to welcome Pavel Grahovic to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. It's actually really humbling to be here addressing this audience to the extent where everybody in here knows much more about the tourism industry than I do. But I was hoping to perhaps be able to offer some generalization which I think are relevant at this point in time, and some specific examples from other industries that I think might be helpful to you. So the title of the presentation is Monetizing Customers in Rapidly Changing Markets, and I will talk a little bit about what rapidly means and why I believe that actually we are at a very interesting point in time in terms of the way that the markets we serve will change. And I have three key messages for you that I wanted you to take away. Number one, the landscape is changing. And I will explain why it's changing faster than it has been. But at the same time, I will also try to explain why this landscape change is challenging for us. Because it's actually still, even though it's changing faster than it has been, it is still slower than the rate of change that we are used to in our everyday lives. Second one, I wanted to highlight the fact that change equals a hot opportunity. I really like this hot moniker, and I'm very proud to wear this T-shirt. And I will try to bring some specific examples to life that clarify why. And lastly, I will clarify why, in my mind, time to act is now. It's not sometime in the future, it's actually now. And I will provide you with some examples of how businesses that didn't act now in a rapidly changing market, how they got left behind, and often went down. So starting from the landscape is changing view, I talk about this in the context of a global generational change. And so I have this chart for you, which comes from my colleagues at the McKinsey Global Institute. And what this is showing is the movement of the center of gravity of the world's GDP. So the world's gross domestic product is moving like this. Now, what I want you to take away is the rate of the change. In the 100 years from the Industrial Revolution, it's moved about that much. In the 50 years after the Second World War, it's moved that much in 50 years, so twice as fast. 100 years, 50 years. In the 25 years between 2000 and 2025, it's moving that same distance again, 4 times as fast. 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, Industrial Revolution, speed times 1. After the war, speed times 2. Right now, speed times 4. This is speeding up. Now, on one hand, it's something to notice and really sit up and say, this is really speeding up. On the other hand, it actually is very challenging for us to grasp. Why? Because human mind is great for known patterns and is not that good with the long-run change. We are challenged by the long-run change. Let me give you an example. When you wake up in the morning and you've got 11 pieces of clothing to put on, if you in fact run all the combinations of those pieces of clothing, you would find that there's about 40 million different combinations. And if you wanted to start trying those combinations, it would take you 76 years at one combination per minute just to test all the combination of clothing you could wear. Now, that would be pretty inconvenient, and of course this is not what we do because it's a known pattern. Because between the ages of 5 and 8, your mother, over 1,000 days, coached you into how to get dressed in the morning. It's very easy for us. For changes that take 10, 20, 30 years, we do not have any capability to observe the pattern. And therefore, we are often blindsided by these changes, even though they might be accelerating. And that's the key thought that I wanted to leave you with. This change is really accelerating, and we as humans are finding it very challenging. If I were to think about some examples, and as I was lying in my bed last night reading The Economist on the iPad, I thought about 15 years ago how I would consume something online. On my CRT tube, together with the buttons that controlled pin cushioning and barreling on the screen, and I even had a 720K floppy drive in my machine, right? Today it's an iPad. That's 15 years. Very easy to forget. Something closer to the industry, 15 years ago when I first started coming to this part of the world, I would still get a paper ticket from my travel agent in London, you know, the multi-pages that they would get torn out as I did all the sectors. Well, now, of course, I travel with my iPhone. 15 years. Change accelerating. And yet, at the same time, it's difficult to grasp. Now, I believe that partly because of this, we might be punching a little bit below our weight. So I'm going to show you some compound annual growth rates. And, you know, this first growth rate, 0.8%, is how our industry has grown in terms of the inbound traffic over the last 5 years. So this is the growth that we had. Now, think about this in the context, you know, if your money in the bank was earning 0.8%, would you be happy with it, or would you seek to change something, move it, you know, to somewhere where there is a little bit more growth? Going forward, our forecast inbound visitor growth, 2.7%. Now, this is great, because, you know, that's already 3 times more. But if I were to be a little bit controversial, Tourism Australia inbound tourism value growth is ambition going forward to 2020 is 8%. So that's times 3. And then if I were to be really controversial and say, and this is not to try and say that China is the answer to everything, but say that, you know, there are places that are growing much faster. These are Chinese households with more than 100,000 RMB disposable income growth to 2020. It's again times 2 from the Australian aspiration and times 6 from what we are forecasting. So, you know, challenge that I wanted to lay here is perhaps in this accelerating change, we are actually missing something. And I think that we're recognizing this and things are changing. So yesterday I heard a most excellent announcement from the Prime Minister about the additional funding. And I have an example based you know, of that I wanted to build on. So if I think about the change in New Zealand holiday arrivals, our traditional markets, they have all gone backwards over the last 5 years. And then, of course, there is Australia, which is a, you know, separate case altogether. But then all the emerging markets have grown and brought us together to roughly a 0 outcome. A thought for you. Those traditional markets, weighted average GDP growth here is about 0. Those emerging markets, China, Malaysia, India, Indonesia, weighted average GDP growth is 5.1% in these markets. So no growth, fast growth. If I then think about the funding, currently Tourism New Zealand funding towards these markets, and that's, by the way, an approximation and my disaggregation, just from public domain information, about $25 million here to those traditional markets, about 15 to these new markets. After Prime Minister's yesterday's announcement, I believe that this is changing to roughly 50-50, $30 million here, $30 million there. So the takeaway really that I would want you to you know, take from all this is the landscape is changing. It's accelerating, but even though it's accelerating, we're finding it challenging. And you know, this new funding and actually everything that's going on in the industry will accelerate this rate of change, and all of this is coming at us. And now we have 2 choices. We can either observe it and then at the end of it say what has just happened, or we can actually make it happen. So now to that making happen part, I wanted to share with you some examples. So why do I believe that change is a hot opportunity? It is absolutely feasible to target higher value customers, as an example. So I mentioned China. You know, as I understand, many people in the industry believe that, you know, the Chinese market might not be as valuable as we think. But here's some really excellent news. This is year-on-year growth in the Chinese market, high value versus all others, high value South Island, FITs, you know, high value tours. High value changed from 20% to 25% as a share of total. But I think what's really important is that the industry observed the challenge with the value of those visitors. The industry has invested. Tourism New Zealand invested, Auckland Airport invested, Air New Zealand invested, Sky City. All of you invested in some way. And as a result, almost half of the total growth was converted into high value. Yesterday, Prime Minister was talking about 1 million Chinese visitors, possibly, you know, in not the distant future. Think about this, 500,000 of them could be high value if we continue doing what we're doing. So absolutely possible to target high value visitors. And if you think about high value, that means wider spread. So there's obviously people here from around the country, from the regions. So example, group visitor footprint. So these are regional, these are RTOs. For a tour, it's all concentrated in Auckland and Rotorua, as we know, two locations. 90% of the quite modest footprint in just 2 locations. Look what happens when you move to FIT. 2 things. So obviously you immediately can see massive spread, but 2 things. Number 1 is 3.5 times the footprint in total, and number 2, about 60% of the total footprint is in the regions. 500,000 Chinese visitors in the regions in not too distant future. So if I were to take this specific example and put it together with some of the things that I said before, number 1, the GDP growth. So these new emerging hot markets are growing very fast. Number 2, we've got funding increases. Industry is acting at the macro level and at the micro level. All of this is coming at us. Number 3, we've got the value growth together. It's a confluence of hot opportunity. All of this is coming, but we need to act in order to be able to accommodate it. Another example, productivity against seasonality. So speaking to many operators in the industry, you've got this massive peak in the high season, and then people are struggling to actually justify the operation. This is not unusual. It exists in the energy industry. It exists in the dairy. In the energy, you need to lay enough infrastructure to pass all the electricity through just for the one day of the peak. In dairy, you need to have enough plant in order to process all the milk just on the day of the peak. The difference here is, just as you can import GDP growth overall, you can actually import capacity utilization. You cannot do that in dairy. Can't bring milk to process. Cannot do this in energy because we isolate it. But you can actually do this in tourism. It's a highly unusual, and it's a highly unusual sector, very powerful concept. So look, all of this is coming at us. And if I were to look at New Zealand overall, this is the seasonal capacity utilization by month, and basically everything between this line and our capacity utilization is unused capacity. If I compare this to Australia, not that I want to compare everything to Australia, but to be controversial, much better capacity utilization in the Australian market. What are they doing in order to do this better? But perhaps most importantly, if I think about individual businesses and the change that is occurring. So I took the same New Zealand curve and I overlaid on it a Chinese visitor utilization, Chinese New Year and shoulder, Indian visitors, and I remember, I used to run big outsourcing contracts in India, and I remember all my Indian friends, they always wanted to come here in the winter to actually escape from the heat, because it's 45 degrees and 100% humidity. And that's what we're observing here, India shoulder. And of course, Japan winter. Imagine if all of a sudden your infrastructure that you've laid on in your businesses was utilized in this significantly better way. Massive opportunity. So, I recently spoke to an operator who's saying, look, Indians, they negotiate really hard. They pay 15% less, but you know what? They keep the operation running in the off-season. So, together, again, hot opportunity for your business in adjusting the mix. But of course, you have to be able to access that mix. You have to be able to cater for it. And we will hear a lot about it in the coming days. But I wanted to give you some examples that hopefully will convince you, will not only give you a way to think about change, but also convince you the time to act is now. So starting from this concept of the growth horizons, and I have some examples from the industries that are known here. So if I take telecom, it used to have the fixed line, but then of course we know it all topped out. So then it went into mobile, and then it went into broadband, and now it's selling fiber. Now, was it easy? No. I was actually sitting on that management team. We had lots of challenges. We lost out in mobile. We were not fast enough. This was a long-run generational change. We were not aware of it. We were not fast enough, and Vodafone stole the march. New Zealand is one of the very few markets where the second entrant took a greater share than the incumbent. But that's what happens if you're not aware of the change that's occurring. We got it wrong in broadband partly too, because we didn't go fast enough and we got regulated. So, this is challenging. This is not easy. But the concept I wanted you to take away is thinking about it in horizons. Let's take New Zealand Post. Seemingly a business where the core is going away. I mean, who's receiving letters these days anymore? And soon they will only be 3 times a week probably. So, of course there was mail. But then the very same online move that killed the mail opened up online purchases, which then resulted in a fabulous growth in the courier business. And then, of course, they went into KiwiBank, because if I've got all the post shops, why shouldn't I open financial services? And now they're in the directories, and Localist is finding it quite difficult. So again, if you drink from a fire hose, a little bit has to come back up. But the important takeaway is this business would have gone away if they focused only on mail. Focus on today's core markets, rapidly changing market. There is no business in 15 years' time. And a good example here is Yellow Pages. Not that I want to be controversial, but they had print directories. Very successful, as we know, massive books. We all got them every year. But of course, they didn't develop additional growth horizons and ended up in receivership. Massive, about $2 billion shareholder value loss. Not aware of the long-run change. Didn't figure out a way to cope with it. Time to act is now. If you come back to the thought of we finding it difficult to establish a pattern in the long-run change, even though it might be accelerating, we don't understand how it's going to run. That's where you, as owners of your businesses or leaders of your businesses, need to put all your time thinking about. So get your best operators to run the current core business serving the current customers, and start thinking about business building on the next generation of businesses that will become your core businesses in a few years' time. Get some visionaries to be thinking about what might be happening in 10 years' time and how do you prepare for it. And I will come back to this, but wanted to build on this concept of horizons and how you grow. Students, as an example. And if you think about the previous example with horizons, it's all about people. When I go and speak at career evenings in New Zealand's universities, invariably the New Zealanders are looking at me saying, hey, you've been in England and the US, how can I go there? And the Indian and Chinese students who are here are saying, how, you came here and you stayed here, how can I stay here? Massive opportunity. You want to access new markets that are difficult to understand for Anglo-Saxons. There are plenty of educated people who are culturally relatively well aligned because they're living here and studying here who could help. Now, students is actually a bigger opportunity because I insist that we're not linking the tourism and education enough. And there's a massive opportunity with, for example, 30,000 Chinese students in our country right now whose wealthy parents are coming here, traveling here. And when I ask at the university, do you have a parent program? Invariably they say no. Opportunity, 30,000 times 2, 60,000 high net worth individuals because they have their kids studying in an expensive university in a Western country. 60,000 high net worth individuals who are coming here probably twice a year. Where are they and how are we accessing them? Now, there's a bunch of other examples and perspectives on this. For example, someone mentioned, why do we have graduation ceremonies a number of months after the course has finished? And all those overseas parents can't come because they've already gone back home. Well, I actually went digging into this, and what I found is the reason for it is because 50 years ago or 30 years ago, all the exam papers would go on a ship to the UK to be marked, and then they would come back several months after, and then there was a graduation ceremony. Well, guess what? They are now getting marked in here. Graduation ceremony could be a day after graduation. 30,000 graduates a year, 60,000 high net worth individuals in New Zealand for the ceremony. Just a thought. So, thinking then back to the growth and the growth horizons, and maybe trying to put some a little bit more specific framework around this for you. I thought about the 7 degrees of freedom in the context of growth. So, starting from something really simple, more sales to same customer mix. I remember when my friends at a European telecommunications company issued a business broadband package, which was basically the same broadband connection as the regular broadband connection, but it came with a guild certificate saying this is a business connection and it's capable of running 4 computers. And they put it to the small businesses. They actually made a lot of money out of this. It didn't actually cost them anything other than providing some manuals and catering to the need, because all of a sudden they got a whole lot more connections from the small businesses. They were making a whole lot more money from those connections, even though it was exactly the same product. So, we are dealing with higher, with wealthy people, high net worth individuals, it's easy to forget what's happening in those markets. They are willing to pay. And if one argues that we might be perhaps too expensive at the low end of the market, relatively, because we're far away, because our product is relatively small scale, we possibly might be great value, maybe one would argue too cheap, at the luxury end. So obviously product has to be matched with the price, and you can't take it too far, but here's a thought for you to take. Would you make your lower-end product better value? Would you raise your price on the high-end product? Existing products to new customers. A great example that I actually learned at Trends, a business, an activity-based business, a tourism business here in New Zealand, attracted Bollywood stars who were filming in the South Island. These Bollywood stars blogged on their social media. The business supported it. Now their biggest customer base is actually Indians. And even though my other operator was saying that Indians negotiate hard, well, these Indians, that's aspirational. They actually worth 30% more than any other customer group, not by volume, but by the value, by what they spend. New products and services, and especially services. So for Anglo-Saxons and Europeans coming to New Zealand is very accessible. Now, I come from Eastern Europe, so for me it was actually a little bit more challenging. But for Asians who are from a completely different culture, and yet this is where the volume is coming from, it's more challenging still. What are the new services that we are going to lay on in order to accommodate the growth? And by the way, these customers are willing to pay to have it made easy for them. Better delivery systems for customers. A great example with SkyCity, for example, the high roller program, where everything is laid on and it's an integrated system, all the way from the door, in China or wherever it is, through to the personal individual suite, here in Auckland, escorted, everywhere. Now, of course, that's a very small segment, but how can we make it easier? And I think Ken and David will be talking about accessing these customer bases through new channels, accessing them directly, because they're evolving so quickly.